this week I wanted to focus on Descartes, even though there are a couple people covered in this section of the reading. I think Descartes is the most difficult, but also the most interesting. I think to really understand Descartes well, it's important to understand the philosophy that had been done before Descartes and also the scientific advances during the time of Descartes. So philosophy before Descartes, really, you had Plato, who we've talked about before, and Plato influenced many of the founders of the Christian church, and he had an intense focus on the intelligible realm. And when we say intelligible realm, right, we mean the forms that we talked about last week, these um, ideal forms that exist somewhere out there. And that's something that very much influenced the Christian religious movement. And for almost 1,200 years after Plato, there was a very narrow focus on philosophy looking into the nature and existence of God. But around the 1600s, things start to change a little bit. Now, not that I want you to memorize dates or anything like that, but I think putting it in this historical perspective helps. Around 1600, you had a lot of scientific advances that started happening. The first was an invention by Galileo that confirmed exactly what Copernicus had been theorizing earlier. Galileo's telescope brought empirical evidence that we are not at the center of the universe, as we thought for a long time. Galileo would invite monks to look into his telescope, but they refused because they thought he was looking at the devil. Nonetheless, this invention of the telescope shook up all of the established views of the world. Galileo was threatened with death when he tried to publish his work. He chose to recant instead of accepting death, which you might note is a little different than Socrates' choice. 2 years later, there was another invention that contributed to this crisis. The double convex microscope was invented by Johann Kepler in 1611, and as opposed to opening up the heavens above us, the microscope opened up this microscopic world here on Earth, which we didn't even know existed before. And so in a lot of ways, everything that history had shown us to be true in the past was cast into doubt. These two inventions really shook things up historically. Descartes was born into this environment. He was born in 1596. So you can see he was in his teenage years when these big, huge inventions were shaking things up. So Descartes, amidst all of this scientific turmoil, basically really ushers in the branch of epistemology in philosophy. Now, yes, of course, Plato dealt in it, but Descartes really is considered one of the fathers of epistemology, and he published his Meditations in 1641. The book does a pretty good job of helping guide you into thinking in the sort of frame of mind that Descartes is in when he's writing his meditation. So it asks you, first of all, to try to find ways to doubt the truth of a bunch of statements. So, for example, one of them is, American astronauts have walked on the moon. How might we doubt that? Well, if you've heard any conspiracy theories, you've probably heard some doubt on that one. Maybe it was filmed in a movie laboratory or a movie studio, right? Perhaps that's a way we could doubt that. How could we doubt that lemons are yellow? Or that this room is filled with light? Or that 2 plus 3 equals 5? Think for a minute about some ways that you could doubt those statements. Okay, if you're getting creative, you can probably see how there are a lot of ways to raise doubts about some of the things that we normally think are pretty certain. Um, in order to come at this from a different direction, think about some falsehoods that you accepted as a child. What are some things that you believed when you were young that you no longer believe anymore? After you've got something in mind, think about what caused you to reject those beliefs. When did you come to understand that those things you believed as a child were false? The next thing to think about is, why might we hang on to some beliefs that we have? Is there some kind of psychological or other benefit to just tenaciously holding on to these beliefs and not raising any questions about them? Think for a minute. Are there some beliefs that you just haven't questioned? There are probably a lot that we could bring up, but the most common one that I've run into as a philosophy instructor is people who are unwilling to question their religious beliefs when we're doing philosophy of religion. Again, I give the preemptive talk that I'm not going into this to change anyone's opinion. We're going to be studying historical discussions of the philosophy of religion. I'm not arguing with anyone from any particular perspective, and yet there are still people who are upset and believe that this is asking them to question their beliefs and simply refuse to do it. So that's one example. Can you think of any others? And if you do, or using those examples you have, or perhaps the example I gave you, why would people want to hang on to those beliefs without questioning them? And finally, once you've thought about that for a little while, ask yourself whether or not you agree with Descartes that it's better to examine and question your beliefs. Is he right about that? He thinks we should question all of our beliefs. Why do you think he's right, or why do you think he's wrong? Okay, getting into understanding his meditations a little bit better. What he's going for is a system of systematic doubt. So instead of refuting each and every one of his beliefs individually, he decides to go straight to the principles on which all of his former beliefs are rested. Right? So he's not going to refute that he believes um, lemons are yellow or that the room is filled with light, right? He's not going to go through each one of those and systematically disprove every belief he has. He's going to look for the principles that formed all of his beliefs. So he asks himself, where do I get the majority of my knowledge? And he realizes it's from his senses. So he asks himself, can our senses deceive us? Clearly, the answer is yes. There are all kinds of times when we're deceived by our senses. Um, think about if you've ever been driving on a hot day and up in the road ahead it looks like you see a puddle of water. But when you get there, there is no puddle of water, right? That's your senses deceiving you. You think you see something that you didn't. I'm sure you can think of all kinds of other examples when your senses have deceived you. So, okay, Descartes says then, well, aren't there certain things that we have vivid experiences of? Um, can we be certain of those? He says, well, no, because what about dreams? We can have very vivid dreams, and yet those aren't real either. So even if we vividly perceive something, he thinks that's still not a way to truly have knowledge of it. So he's doubting everything we can observe with our senses. Then he asks the question, well, what about math? Can't we be certain about math? That's not really something we know through our senses, right? We can know those logically by thinking through them. We don't have to look at one thing and look at another thing, and then that's what shows us it's 2. We know using math 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? So can't math be certain? Well, no, Descartes says. Even that is not certain. Why? And this is really probably the most genius part of his whole meditation. It's the part that stands out and really gets into the spirit of trying to think through things philosophically and do what we call armchair philosophy, thought experiments. He says, we can't be sure even of math because there could be an evil demon. And I just want to read briefly his passage about that. I will then suppose that not God, who is supremely good and the fountain of truth, but some evil demon, no less powerful than deceitful, has employed his whole energies in deceiving me. I will think that the heavens, the earth, the colors, shapes, sound, and all other external things are nothing but illusions and dreams of which this demon has availed himself, in order to lay traps for my credulity. I will consider myself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, no senses, yet falsely believing myself to possess all of these things. To really understand this systematic doubt might help to think of some movies. Of course, the one that's probably already come to mind is The Matrix, right? Everything in Neo's reality at the beginning of the movie is incorrect. He's being deceived by the computer program that he's plugged into. Think of The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, right? He's living in this world where everything is produced and planned for him. Or think of Dark City. That one's a little lesser known than perhaps the other two, but it's one that's really interesting to look at if you haven't seen it. So this is kind of what Descartes is imagining, right? Perhaps there's some way that we are being completely deceived by everything around us. How can we know for sure that that's not the case? Now, here's where Descartes sometimes gets questioned, especially by students who might ask, well, why is he doing something like this, right? This has nothing to do with our day-to-day life. We are in the reality we're in, so why does it matter? Well, it's really hard to criticize him for not addressing everyday problems because this is kind of like criticizing Galileo's telescope for not helping us watch TV, right? The point of the telescope isn't to help us watch TV, it's to help us look out at the heavens. And so for Descartes, his point is to address the great mysteries of life and not the simple day-to-day questions. And to do that, it takes practice and sometimes very strange thinking to be able to get into this frame of mind. So I hope you're starting to see a little better what that frame of mind is and how you might get into it. Okay, in Meditation 2, Descartes decides that there is one single thing that he can be certain about. And it's a phrase you've probably heard before, cogito ergo sum. Translated to English means I think, therefore I am. Incidentally, this leads to one of the philosophy jokes that I know. Imagine Descartes, right, is back alive in modern times, and he's trying out this newfangled technology, the airplane. And he gets on the plane, it takes off, and the flight attendant comes by and says, "Oh, hi, sir. Can I get you anything to drink?" And Descartes says, "I think not." And then, poof, he disappears. Right? I know, it's kind of cheesy. So back to cogito ergo sum. Descartes realizes that maybe all his senses are deceived. He can't know anything around him. But he does know that he's thinking, right? If he can think, my senses might be deceived. He is thinking, so he knows he is a thinking being. He knows that because he's thinking, that means he exists somehow, right? He might not have the hands and eyes and ears that he mentioned in his passage, but something about him exists. He exists in some way. So this is his one certainty. I exist. I am a thinking thing. This is where you run into what's known as Cartesian dualism, which basically means that the mind is separate from the body, right? So we may not have a body at all. We can be completely deceived about that, but we can be certain we have a mind. And so for Descartes, it's possible to separate those two out. We're going to talk a lot more about different theories that relate to the mind and the brain later. But for now, realize that for Descartes, the mind can be separate. Okay, in Meditation 3, he says, okay, so maybe we're being systematically deceived. Does that mean that we can never find anything out for certain about reality? That's frustrating. He wants to be able to talk about reality, right? Yes, he has this project of doubt, but ultimately he wants to be able to prove that reality exists. So he decides that there's only one way to do this. We need to prove that there is a God who would not want us to be deceived. He asks if constant deception is even possible with a God that is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent. This is basically the traditional Christian, Judeo-Christian God, who's all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. So I don't want to get bogged down in the details of the argument that Descartes uses to prove God's existence right now. We'll look at that in more detail when we're doing the philosophy of religion. But basically, he uses something very similar to the argument that St. Thomas Aquinas had used before him, and uses that to prove that God exists. Okay, so from there, Descartes really wants to move from perception of the mind to perception of corporeal things, real, tangible things around us. But all he has is that he exists as a thinking thing and that God exists. So how does he get from that to actual things around us existing? Okay, well, he says, we know that God created everything, which means God created our minds, which we have already proved exists. So if what we clearly and distinctly perceive to be true were false, then God would be a deceiver. So think about that. The things we clearly and distinctly perceive, if they're false, that means God is deceiving us because he created us in order to be able to perceive them. But Descartes says since God is perfect, he isn't a deceiver. So whatever we clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Okay, moving from there, he wants to prove things in the world actually exist. And he says, since God has given me no faculty whatsoever for making this determination, but instead has given me a great inclination to believe that these ideas issue from corporeal things, I fail to see how God could be understood not to be a deceiver if these ideas were to issue from a source other than corporeal things, and consequently, corporeal things exist. So what Descartes is saying is when we look around and see a lemon, we think it's yellow, we have an inclination to believe that the reason we think we see a lemon and believe that it's yellow is because there's really a yellow lemon there. And so he's saying that since God created us to think that way, that must be the way things are, essentially. This is all really interesting, and I know it's a lot to take in. But one of the things I encourage you to do anytime we're talking about a theory is to try to think about objections to it. So see if you can think of any, really briefly. One of the ones I'll give you, maybe to get you thinking if you're having trouble, is this idea of clear and distinct perceptions. Remember earlier when we were talking about Descartes, he had a problem with clear and distinct perceptions. Think about when we were talking about dreams, and he called them vivid experiences, right? So these are clear and distinct perceptions, aren't they? How would dreams work in that, right? So if he's saying God created us, and we tend to believe in all these things because they're clear and distinct, well, that doesn't respond to his own criticism about dreams. Don't we believe in many dreams that we clearly and distinctly perceive something? Do you think that's a possible problem for Descartes here? His definition of when an idea or perception is distinct is when it is so sharply separated from all perceptions that it contains within itself only what is clear. And an idea is clear when it is present and accessible to the attentive mind. So based on that, what do you think? Does the objection about dreams apply to Descartes here? I hope that's helped you understand the arguments of Descartes a little better and see how he gets from his systematic doubt to once again proving that corporeal things around us exist. Let me know if you have any questions.